Hello, my name is Eric Hahn, and welcome to Shit I Have to Teach in 20 Minutes, a podcast for history teachers and anyone in a hurry. In each episode, my colleague Rob Good and I will interview an historian about their scholarship and leadership, asking them to identify the most important concepts they think teachers should share with their students about the topic of the day. We will also include a free lesson that's free, no cost to you, a free lesson plan that can be downloaded from the episode notes linked to this podcast. So, Rob, what is our topic for today?
Hey, Eric. Well, today we are going to be delving into colonial United States history. And I have to admit, when I was teaching, I was always anxious about this unit. Since the topic came at the start of the school year, I wanted to make sure I opened the class in a way that captured my students' attention and set a foundation for the rest of the course.
Well, it's interesting that you say that you were anxious about colonial America because I taught across the hall from you for many years. And whenever I knew you were teaching about colonial history, I saw your students coming out of the classroom in a conga line. They were so excited about learning from you about colonial history. They were talking in their free time in the halls, lunch periods. They were just all over the topic of colonial America.
I actually revolutionized their life. And because that anxiety produced it, well, absolutely not. But lucky for us, today we are joined by Lorri Glover. She's the Francis Bannon Endowed Chair in History at St. Louis University. Lorri is an expert on the social and political history of the colonial and revolutionary periods, and her most recent book examines the life of Eliza Lucas Pinckney, a remarkable 18th century woman who challenged the gender boundaries of her time and reshaped South Carolina's economy through her innovation in cultivating indigo, although that's a little bit of an interesting story as well. Thank you so much for joining us today, Lorri, particularly on this, our inaugural episode of the pod.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm grateful to be here.
That's great. So, Lorri, what do you believe are the most important concepts about the colonial period that history teachers should share with their students?
Okay, so the first one is a little bit of a critique of what Rob said. He said he called it colonial US. And so I think one of the most important things to teach students about colonial America is to not read the late 18th century back into the 16th and the 17th century. So, no one in 16th, 17th, early 18th century North America or the English Caribbean knew that the United States was coming. They're not like, sitting around like, well, when twiddling their thumbs, when will the revolution begin? And so one of the concepts I try very hard to move my students away from is any mention of the 13 original colonies. Because if you enter history from the late 16th century going forward, England created, later on Great Britain, had 20-something colonies in what they call the New World. The first permanent English colony was in Virginia, and the second permanent English colony was in Bermuda. And Bermuda has a fascinating history. And then the colonization, English colonization, happens kind of a hodgepodge of the mainland of North America down in the Caribbean. Bermuda is out in the sort of central southern Atlantic. And you would miss all of that if you thought about colonial America just as the background to the coming of the United States. Also, you erase a lot of people's history if you jump from, say the Pilgrims to the Revolutionaries. That's about, 180 something years of history. 160 something years of history. So it'd be kind of like if we said everything that's happening today in the United States, we could trace back to, I don't know, the 1860s or 1870s. So are there connections between the 1860s and 70s and the 2020s? Absolutely. But if you think about what happened in the 1860s and 70s, only as background to present day America, then you've missed a lot of fascinating history. And so I try to get students to enter colonial America from the 17th century and look forward rather than the late 18th century and look back.
Well, first, Eric is very happy that you've corrected me because he spent a whole career correcting me. So, but that is really an important concept. And, and so thank you for that correction. And also the question that I have too for teachers that are trying to narrate this to their students and develop some frameworks is we often have this sort of east to west, process that was developed by the historians in Virginia and Massachusetts, but there's from the south to the north, from the west to the east. Do you suggest that in thinking about colonial America and colonization as a process, that teachers open up their courses by sort of challenging those notions of?
Oh, absolutely, Rob. Absolutely. Kathleen Duvall's book, Native Nations, just won the Pulitzer Prize. And she's among, sort of a generation of Native American historians of Native America who begin with Native America, right? So I'm in St. Louis, and I could start my class with Cahokia, which is right across the Mississippi River. And if you think about the story of early America, of 17th and early 18th century North America, and you focus just along the Atlantic seaboard, then you're getting a very thin slice of history. And you're missing a tremendous amount of like a continental wide history. So I often begin my classes by saying, where do we begin? Right? Like, do you begin with the reconquest of Jerusalem? In the 1490s? Do you begin, in Hispaniola in 1492? Do you begin in Cahokia? Like, where should our story begin? And that's an exercise that points toward what I think is the second most important thing I try to teach my students. And that's about the necessity of multiple perspectives. So if you tell the story of colonization or even colonial North America only from the point of view of the English descended newcomers who settled on the Atlantic coast, then you've missed out again on all kinds of history, including the history of their experiences in places like Massachusetts and Virginia and Pennsylvania, because they don't arrive in sort of unsettled territory. They're entering other people's countries. They're entering other people's cultures and other people's economies. And that, to me, makes the history much more relevant and relatable to students today. But it's also just the truth of history, and that's what we want to start with. Like, what is really the truth, and as full a story of the history as we can get.
That's first of all, thank you very much for correcting Rob. You already have an A plus, no matter what you say from now on. So that you've already made my day. I know that, and for the listeners too, I'm sure they appreciate that as they get to know Rob a little bit better. Anyway, a couple of things that kind of are associated with the first part of what you said, and then this most recent idea of for students to have multiple perspectives in colonial America. What about that? You mentioned sort of the British dominance in colonial America, or at least what's going to become the United States, even though it's not necessarily there even in an idea yet. Were there any other types of activities that were legal or illegal that the British had as far as trade or sharing ideas with other countries? A type of globalization, even though I think that term is probably a little bit early to use at that point. But what would you say that? And then, sorry to add this next point, you mentioned one of my favorite questions: when and where should teachers start with colonial America? I mean, we could go back and we could not even start in Northern America? If you think that would be reasonable.
Well, it's a challenge, right? Because you've got a finite amount of time. You've got, state standards in most schools. You've got curriculum guidance out of your district. But really, time is, to me, the work I do, time is the biggest constraint. And you don't want to lose the students, right? So it's challenging. But to your first question, I mean, I absolutely think a global perspective is not at all inappropriate for understanding 16th, 17th, and 18th century. You know, the English are latecomers to colonization. They're far behind the Spanish. They're behind the French. They're in competition with other European powers. And they're entering, when they're in North America, they're entering a kind of completely different geopolitics of different nations, empires, that already are operating trade networks and sometimes in conflict with one another in indigenous North America. So I think thinking globally, I mean, one of the main constructs of the last couple of generations of early American history is to focus on the Atlantic. So, like it's an Atlantic based global set of exchanges of people, of culture, of commodities, of diseases. And that puts, the Pilgrims in Plymouth and the Virginians in Jamestown. That puts them in a proper and a much wider context. The other challenge for teachers, I think, is not only the time and the scope and where to begin, but how to find the evidence. And so, what are the sources for uncovering these different perspectives? And that's really the third thing that I think is so vital to understanding colonial America, to teaching about colonial America. I like that saying, no problem comes without a gift in its hand. So the problem for anyone trying to study colonization in North America is that there are large caches of documents for a few places and for a few people's perspectives. And there is a thin amount of evidence for other people's and other perspectives. And then there are like whole parts of the story that are lost to history, right? Like we don't have a lot of records for certain things. So it's a challenge. But the gift that problem has is, and this is probably why students left Rob's class excited and energized, colonial America presents us a chance to be detectives, to be historical detectives, to develop theories about what might have happened, to engage in debate, and to learn together. So it's a highly collaborative undertaking. It's highly speculative, and I think highly imaginative. And so I'm drawn to that as a researcher. I wouldn't want to work in the late 19th century or early 20th century where there are more sources than you could ever look at, right? And they're all typed, and there were like rooms full of sources that you'd have to sort through. I kind of like the imagining, and I think students like the imagining. And we just have to find the sources and find the tools to help them engage the sources to open up their imaginations.
That's so powerful. And especially I'm thinking about the challenge that teachers have now between balancing sort of these traditional and sort of progressive, narratives of, oh, this march to democracy, but dealing with what some people have called hard history or challenging history or complex history, and the fact that there is a disparity in the sources. So do you suggest that teachers seek to balance the record, to get those multiple perspectives, to find those records from indigenous voices, from enslaved people, as well as other people that were in the colonial world?
Yeah, so one of the favorite sources I use is an online repository called Freedom on the Move. It's a consortium. It's mostly out of, I think, Cornell University took the leadership on it, but it's a crowdsourced but rigorously proofed project of collecting advertisements that enslavers buy to try and recover people who have fled enslavement. So it's called Freedom on the Move. We used to call those people runaways or escaped slaves, but there's different language now. So those materials, advertisements in newspapers to recover people who have fled for freedom, are created for one particular purpose, right? So the purpose is for the enslaver to get that person back. But if you read those sources creatively and thoughtfully and in a context, you can see the lives of people, the experiences and the dreams and the ambitions of people that might otherwise have been lost, right? So one person's escape is another person's flight toward a hopeful, different future. And it seems to me if we want to find people in the American past who, loved liberty, who were courageous in their, defense of freedom, then we can look at those advertisements of people who fled bondage and, often took their children with them, just with the hope of a different future. So I find that very inspiring, and I find that very patriotic. Just not in the traditional way we might think about courage and loving of liberty and leadership. But it's there if we look.
What a powerful way to bring this to a close, because I think that the people that are listening to this in their cars on their way to school are thinking, oh my God, I've got to find that repository. So look for it in our episode notes. We are definitely going to put a link to Freedom on the Move there. We can't thank you enough, Lorri, for joining us this morning and talking to us about your experience and your wisdom and sharing some ways to tackle colonial America. See, I can be taught, Eric. I can learn.
You can.
It's slow, but I can learn.
Nice work.
And we also appreciate your willingness to serve as the inaugural guest on our podcast. We could not have asked for a better scholar. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here, and hope that the teachers and other listeners find something of value in thinking differently about the past and about the sources to explore colonial America.
I want to echo Rob's thanks. Thank you, Lorri. And remember, you can download your free lesson or lessons from the link provided in the episode notes.
And please be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts and on Instagram.
You can reach us for any feedback, questions, or suggestions you might have about the conversations or lessons at historyin20@gmail.com. History in 20 is all spelled out. We'd love to hear from you. And thank you, listeners, for joining us today.
The clock is ticking, 20 minutes, time is spinning, pulling facts from thin air. Hope they think I came prepared.
What a great conversation that was with Lorri Glover. I know I learned a lot, and I am sure that our listeners did as well. Lorri's discussion about when and where to start a discussion about colonial America inspired me to write a lesson that asked students to do the same thing. In the lesson, students are given an option of 10 different times, and in groups, they decide which one they think is the most important and where we should start the class, and then they defend that decision to the rest of the class. Eric, what lesson did you develop?
Well, I'd never heard of the website Freedom on the Move before, and Lorri mentioned that her students find it really engaging to learn about colonial history by reading ads from freedom seekers. So what I propose is that students will get into groups of 3 or 4, and then they'll each read one ad from a different time period in colonial America. And then when they're finished reading that ad, and they answer a couple of questions, and then they'll share what they learned with other students. Then they'll write a paragraph about what they learned. So enjoy. I think the students are going to find it challenging, fun, and engaging.
Well, As long as you're not teaching it. As long as you're not teaching it.
That's right.
And
Easy
remember,
for me to say.
and remember, you can download both of these lessons from the episode notes for this podcast. Have a great day.
Have a good time in the classroom.
And get going. All
Yeah.
right.